Okay, so we're going to be breaking down a whole chicken. And so first things first, we want to take our chicken and we want to remove the wishbone. And so you can find the wishbone where the neck is. Typically, obviously, the neck's going to be at the top where the wings were. I have to kind of pull the skin up, and it's not something that you can see, but you can definitely feel it with your fingers. And it's shaped, you know, wishbone shaped, obviously. So what you want to do is find that wishbone and then run your knife right along it on either side. And then even cut along the top. And sometimes when you pull it out, it's breaks. Sometimes it's broken before you even pull it out. This one actually feels a little bit broken, so it'll come out in a couple pieces. There's one part. And there's the other part. And so, let's see, how are they attached to one another? I'll put these over there. Parts for the wishbone. Okay, next. Next, I'm going to just remove the wings. A wing is, there's actually two parts to a wing. There's the drumette, and then there's the wingette. And so we want to make this an airline chicken breast, so we want to leave that drumette on. And so I'm going to just slip my knife right in between and get that wing right off. And if you find that there's any kind of resistance when you're trying to use your boning knife to slice that wing off, then you are to the left or the right of the joint. It should come off very easily because there is a natural seam there. Now I'm just going to turn myself around, have the where the feet would be, the legs pointing towards me. It's always good to kind of make sure you're pushing all that skin down before you make your incisions to pop out the leg joints, just because you want this nice skin coverage on the breast. Breast on either side, there's the breastbone right there. So you can actually see, this is a really nice chicken in that you can see right where it wants to be cut. It's actually like indicating, telling you where I want to get cut. Okay, so I make those slices and then I'll just pop both of those joints out. Now they kind of act like a kickstand for my chicken. Next, I'm going to remove both the breasts. So I'm going to start, and again, this breastbone goes all along the front, one straight line, and so I'm going to use my knife to pull one breast off and then the other side. So we'll go with this one first. You want to try and do, you know, fluid motion following the bone, not sawing motion, because that's really going to damage the meat. You can see that I got all the way down to the rib cage, and now just using the tip of my knife and gravity, really, because gravity is kind of pulling it down as well. And ideally, you want to try and make sure that there's as little meat left on the carcass as possible. I'm using my bottom hand and I'm going to pull this drumette out of the way so that I don't cut through it. A very common mistake is removing it at this point. And now what I'm looking for is that joint in order to release this breast. It's right there. Now I can see it. See, there's that joint right there. And then go. There's also a nice, this is a rather large chicken, and so there's a big tender. I'm going to take this tender right off. There's my airline breast. One tender. I'll leave this one more rustic and leave the drumette intact. I'll French the next one. Okay, and the other one, following the breastbone along the other side. I'm repositioning my bird just because it's easier for me this way. Notice again, I'm kind of curving my knife because the rib cage slides down. I'm just basically sliding my knife up along that rib cage. You should be using a boning knife when doing this. My boning knife is just shaped a little differently than a typical one, but it is a boning knife. And now I have that drumette under there. I'm just gonna pull him out of the way so I don't slice through him. And again, if you're meeting some kind of tension, then you just haven't found that joint. I can see that joint right there, going straight through it. And again, pull that tender right off. Now with this guy, I'll show you how to French, just so you can see the technique. Just cutting right along the base, and then I'm going to pull. Now to remove the thighs and the legs. So it's really easy actually, because you can see that joint right there. What we want to do is make sure that we keep the oysters intact with the thigh. And what's great is you can actually see the oysters, these two plump little sacs right there on the back. And that's a great place to start when you're breaking a chicken down. You can kind of just start by using the edge of your knife to kind of peel into that oyster so that it stays intact. And then you can flip it over. Thigh right there. If I wanted to trim this off, this fatty deposit off, I could. And then the same goes for over here. I usually will try and use my knife to just kind of you could even technically push that oyster so that you can get it out nice and clean. And then find that joint. And really just follow the bone. And then you can always trim it up if there's extra fat or anything like that. Okay, and then, so this would be the carcass. I will trim the carcass because I want to use it for stock. Just trimming the excess fat, that will just add something to my stock that I don't want. So I have my carcass there. Lastly, I'm going to separate my legs and my thighs from one another. So again, usually you can kind of see a natural seam in meat. It's also going to be something that, again, if you have any kind of tension, you're going to have an issue. If you have an issue with getting your knife through that bone, you're just to the left or to the right of this joint. There is this natural seam. It's kind of hard to see on this side. You can kind of see it right there. And usually that's where you cut. And if you have any resistance, then you go to the left or right. But this was just right on. So we have 2 thighs, 2 legs. Yeah, right there. Alright, so now we're going to work on the mirepoix and the knife cuts for the braised chicken. We'll start with the mirepoix. Just have some celery that's been trimmed and washed. Always good to wash your produce and trim it up so that it looks nice. I'm going to keep the cuts larger than usual because chicken's going to have to braise for anywhere from 2 to 3, sometimes 3.5 hours depending on the size of the chicken and the age of the chicken. But I am going to be intentional with the knife cuts. I'm not just going to rough chop them because I'm hoping that some of this mirepoix will hold up in the cooking process and will look nice on the plate. And so anything that I don't like the look of, I'm going to save for as trim for a stock. And I'm just going to be slicing this celery on a bias. Taking the trim, saving it for stock. Next, I'm going to take the carrots, which I've also trimmed and peeled. I'm going to cut these oblique cut. With an oblique cut, I'll do my first cut as trim. Then I'm going to roll the cut onto that flat side that I just cut. And then straight up and down again. So I have a nice long pointy piece. Then again, after I've sliced it, roll it onto that cut side once again, and cut an oblique cut, cut on a bias. Roll it on that flat side. Go into the same bowl because they're all going into the same pot. Next, I'm gonna go after my onions. These are rather large. I have already trimmed both the tail and the root and pulled the peels, cut the onions in half. Now I'm just gonna follow the natural lines of the onion and slice them down. Wouldn't say this is, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like 6 equal pieces, so cutting it into 6 because this one is a rather large onion. If you have a much smaller onion, which could certainly be possible, then you could cut it in quarters or even thirds. You want the pieces to be relatively large because they really, really melt down and form the basis for your sauce because they're gonna flavor that braising liquid the better. Okay, next I'm going to work on my leeks. Leeks typically have that long green top. The top has been trimmed, the root has been trimmed. Break this down into shorter pieces, cut those pieces in half. The root needs to be trimmed just a touch more. Looks like these are pretty clean. I did wash them. I'll probably still run them under cool water, but I'm just gonna do relatively thin sliced onions. Not super thin, but I want these to really melt down. These will give a creaminess to the braising jus. Okay, so continuing on with doing our knife cuts for our braise, we also have some Roma tomatoes. I'm not going to concasse these. I'm just gonna trim the ends. The root end, I'll use that for stock. And then depending on the size, I'm cutting him down in half and then cutting those halves in half. So I have it in eighths. I want to keep these pieces relatively large. If you have a much smaller tomato, you could cut it down even smaller. You could cut it down into 6 if you wanted to. The tomato is going to break down quite a lot in your sauce and not going to hold its shape, and so really I think keeping the pieces large will help you to manage how long you can still have some flavor in the ingredients. I think all the flavor will be lost really quickly if you cut these tomatoes too small. I also have some finely chopped parsley. I also have bouquet garni. A bundle of herbs tied together with twine. I have a couple bay leaves, a few sprigs of marjoram, and some fresh thyme. I also have 5 whole cloves of garlic that have been trimmed and peeled, and I'm going to keep those whole. And this is our mirepoix and what we need for building our chicken braise. Okay, so I have my pan preheating, getting nice and hot, and first things I'm going to do is I am going to aggressively season these chicken pieces with kosher salt. A lot of this seasoning will get knocked off in the braising process, and you really want to make sure that you're doing your part to make this flavorful. I usually season really high, season from up really high. It's easier to evenly disperse the seasoning if you do it from way up high. Using kosher salt, always. Okay, I'm not going to season with black pepper. I find it just looks a little dirty in this presentation. I want to keep it nice and clean. I am going to select a neutral oil that has a really high smoke point because I'm trying to get a nice hard sear on these chicken pieces, and so I have a canola oil here. And I'm gonna place these chicken pieces skin side down. Super high heat, and I want to make sure not to overcrowd the pan, and so not all of these pieces are all going to fit in here at once. That's totally fine. You do it in batches. I'm not trying to cook it through, and I will very likely drain out that fat. I'm just trying to get nice crispy skin. In fact, I am going to drain a little bit of that fat out right now. Keep my heat really high. It's going to prevent these pieces from sticking. And get that nice golden crust on the outside. Gently get a crust on there. Maybe on a little bit more. I'm going to leave it alone. You can see the caramelization happening, which is good. Exactly what we want. Again, not trying to cook these chicken pieces through. Just trying to develop caramelization. Alright, it's a nice caramelization. I'm going to flip these chicken pieces away from me always. It's going to splash into grease. That grease is better off falling away from me than towards me. I think I can probably add one more piece to this pan now. I'm not going to choose a big piece. Probably one of the thinner ones. All the caramelized pieces, not fully cooked, they're all raw, so they went right back onto the same tray I was using before. I'm going to set them aside. Now I'm going to use the same pan. I'm going to add my mirepoix. This is a large chicken, so I need a lot of mirepoix. If your chicken's smaller, you can use less, but it's good generally to make sure that your pot is at least halfway full. Because we're going to caramelize this mirepoix, we want to cook it way down, and it really is going to cook down. There was some fat in the pan. I'm going to add a little bit more fat. Now I'm going to add just a touch of olive oil. I don't want a lot of fat in this pan because really that fat's just going to be something that's going to rise to the top. I don't need to add any salt to this. There was quite a lot of salt at the bottom of this pan that came off of our chicken pieces. We season it pretty aggressively, remember? Giving it a nice stir. And then I'm going to put a lid on it. Keep that nice medium high. Put a lid on it, and I'm looking to caramelize this mirepoix. It's going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And the longer you take, the more caramelized it's going to get. The more caramelized it gets, the more intense the flavor is going to become. Once this mirepoix is caramelized, we're going to add the rest of our ingredients and finish our braise. Okay, so we're about halfway through the caramelization process. I've been frequently lifting the lid and giving it a good stir, making sure that it's not sticking anywhere. Making sure everything is getting caramelized evenly, and that nothing is burning. If it looks like it was getting too hot, I turn it down. But really, I've kept the heat pretty much the same, and as long as you just check it every once in a while, as long as you keep that lid on it, it'll kind of trap enough moisture in where it won't burn as long as your heat doesn't go too high. You're not putting it on high heat. It's toggling between medium and medium-high, depending on what type of burner you're using. Some burners you're going to need to stay on high heat in order to achieve that caramelization, but you definitely want to see some color starting to develop. You can see this pan used to be 3/4 of the way full, or almost 3/4 of the way full, and now it's about halfway. I'm going to let it caramelize maybe for another 5 minutes, at which time we're going to deglaze the pan and then add our chicken pieces. First we'll add our tomato and our garlic. Let that toast just a touch. Then we will deglaze our pan and put our chicken pieces back in and get it into the oven. Give it one more stir before it goes back in. Okay, our mirepoix has been caramelizing for easily a good 20 minutes. And see some nice caramelization here. If it looks a little bit dry, that's okay. Okay, we don't want to introduce any more fat to the pan at this point. We're going to add our Roma tomatoes and our whole cloves of garlic. Not looking to cook these down really, just trying to get a little bit of a toast on them, warm them through. Now I'm going to start adding my liquid components. If there was any kind of brown bits still stuck to the bottom of the pan, which it's unlikely because that mirepoix really did do the work of deglazing this pan, but if we did happen to have any kind of brown bits, adding some sort of alcohol really does help. I like adding brandy for this braise. And a little bit of white wine. Now, usually when I'm trying to flambe a pan, I'll just tilt it to the side and use the flames, but this pot's kind of deep, so I'm going to use my Swan lighter. See, it did just barely flame up. It might not even, just a tiny bit. It wants to. I think probably that wine is hiding the brandy a little bit. But really, the flames it looks like it might scorch your mirepoix a little bit. If it does, don't worry about it. You can end up straining that out. Honestly, it'll give really good flavor. It's just cooking off the alcohol at this point. Shake your pan a little bit, it goes out. Now I'm at the point where I'm going to put my chicken pieces back into the pan. I personally, as long as I have nice clean hands, I really like using hands as a tool. It's my own personal preference. I do want to make sure that these pieces get nice and submerged, and I will end up turning them throughout this cooking process. I am going to add a little bit more liquid, but I wanted to get my chicken pieces in first. It's okay if the pan is a little bit crowded. You'll be amazed at how much these pieces will shrink. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of brown chicken stock. Not submerging these pieces all the way. A lot of juice is going to come out. I am going to turn my heat on and just bring this up to a simmer before I put a cover on it and put it into the oven. I have my oven set at 325 degrees. You could braise at a higher temperature if you wanted to. You could braise at 350 if you wanted to. That will make it, the higher you reduce and the higher you cook this braise, the quicker these braising liquids will reduce, more caramelization will happen, and it will have a more complex flavor. I want to keep this kind of medium bodied, and so that's why I'm choosing to do it nice and low and slow, 325 degrees. Now that I can see that simmer going on, I know I'm ready to place a little parchment paper on top and place it into the oven. This is going to braise anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. I'm going to check it probably halfway through. So we're going to prepare our potato puree. I have some large diced potatoes that have been boiling in water that started cold, and 3 whole garlic cloves. How you cut the potato is going to determine how quickly this potato cooks, obviously, and it's always good to just take one out. You want to make sure your potatoes are cut uniform, so you're able to kind of just choose any potato and know if it's ready. And then usually what I'll do is just like press it underneath a fork, and that looks like they're about right on. I think the key to a good potato puree is mise en place, having your mise en place ready to go so that as soon as you drain your potatoes from the water, you're ready to go. So I have my cold butter, that's essential, cold butter already cut up into small pieces, and some hot heavy cream. Really important for that heavy cream to be hot to make sure that the temperature of the potato stays hot and the butter to be cold because we're going to emulsify that butter in. The whole garlic cloves will actually smash right up with the potatoes, and I'm actually going to choose to do it stovetop just because I'm going to assume that maybe not everyone has a mixer at home, although I prefer to use a mixer when I'm making a really fine potato puree. You can mash a potato using just a fork if you need to. So drain those potatoes. If you wanted to save some of that water, you certainly could, or gravy or whatever. There's a nice starchy water there. Now, I have it off the heat, but the potatoes, as you can see, are very, very hot still. And again, this is the sort of thing that's time sensitive. You want to work quickly, and so what I'm doing is just using this large fork to smash the potato up against the edge of the pan. Eventually, I'm going to start incorporating the fats, but at this point, and I haven't even added any heat. I could add heat if I felt like things were starting to cool down a little bit, but really what I'm doing is trying to just pull each and every potato piece over here and make sure I smash it up against the wall. You could use a potato ricer, you could use a food mill, you could use a standing mixer, or a fork. Eventually we'll switch to a whisk, help to get really creamy. Okay, we're going to start to incorporate a little bit of butter, tiny bit of heavy cream. Again, just maybe a teaspoon of heavy cream, just garlic clove right there, smashing him up too. It's just gonna flavor these potatoes. See any big pieces of potato still? Just smash it up against the wall. Obviously, if you like a more rustic preparation, you could leave some chunks and then it's a smash, but we're going for mash. And we're trying to do it by hand, and we have to be very careful to just really try and mash up all those big pieces before we switch to our whisk. Add a little more butter now. Pinch of salt. Touch more heavy cream just to make sure we keep that heat nice and hot in that potatoes. We could on the pan if I wanted to. I'll turn it on nice and low. See, it's getting really, really smooth. Usually what I like to do is, because I'm getting this ready ahead of schedule, and I will be reheating, I'll probably try and keep it about room temperature and then reheat with a little bit more fat. I'm going to resist the urge to add too much more heavy cream because that'll be a really good way to warm it back up. It's a little stiffer than I want for a potato puree. This is more like a mashed potato, very classic. And so I'm going to keep it here, give it a taste. Really tasty. You can taste that garlic. It's good on salt. I think we have enough butter for sure. And it's just a little thicker than I want, which is perfect. I'm going to put a lid on it and put it to the side. And then I will reheat with just a touch of cream and a low heat, whisking constantly right before we plate. So I'm going to start on the sauteed green beans, and so here we have a green bean. You will get Haricot. You want to keep this tail end intact and just trim where it meets the stem, where it would meet the actual plant. So you want to just trim that stem off. If you have any kind of bits that look a little less appealing, you'll want to trim that off as well. But I have a bunch already pre-prepped. I have a nice deep pot that is about halfway filled with water, and I'm going to aggressively season that water. 2 really generous fingers full. I want to make sure that my blanching water is salty like the sea. If you don't have a basket like this, that's totally fine. I would just suggest having some sort of a sieve set up, a colander, so that you can pull these green beans out all at once. Let's make sure we're aggressively seasoning our blanching water. Our water has to be at a rolling boil, and then once it is, we're going to place our green beans into the blanching water. I'm going to keep this same pan because I am going to place the green beans onto that pan once I'm done. Now, there are a couple ways to kind of go about this. I could cook these to al dente, which is having just a tiny bit of bite but fully cooked. And I could technically put them in an ice bath, but I find that an ice bath actually makes it so that the green bean takes on water. And so I'm looking to try and preserve as much flavor without putting too much water and getting these waterlogged at all. So where I'm going to bring them is to this point that I call squeaky. It's the point just before al dente, and what you'll do is you'll take a bite of a bean and it'll actually squeak between your teeth. It's not going to be there yet. It usually takes anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes. And it depends on the size of the bean and how old the bean is, so you're definitely going to want to kind of taste a few. And what you're looking for is just before al dente. That's where that squeaky is going to be. And you'll definitely want to, if your beans vary in size, choose the largest bean for sure. We're not quite at squeaky yet. About 1.5 minutes out. I do have my straining set up right beside me so that I can strain it all in one shot really quickly, because we're not going to be shocking it in an ice bath, and therefore we want to make sure that we can strain it from that hot liquid and get it into a single layer on a sheet tray really quickly. Okay, let's taste one more just to make sure we're at squeaky. Almost, not quite. So we're par cooking these green beans so that we can actually effectively saute them, so that we can cook them really quickly in a small amount of fat, probably butter, a little bit of salt. You could add olive oil in there too. You want to choose a fat that has a nice flavor. Okay. Now, I'm going to strain my green beans. Water. Here. And now I'm going to transfer them in a single layer. Really important to try and get them in that single layer, because if they're piled on top of one another, then they're going to carry over cook. They're going to carry over cook no matter what, because you're not blanching them, or you're not plunging them into an ice bath. And so anything that you can do to make sure that they cool evenly. We're going to drizzle these with olive oil, sprinkle them with a little bit of salt, and just pop them into the freezer until they chill down. And it's just an alternative to shocking them without submerging them in water. A technique I use all summer long. Okay, we've got a pretty even layer on both of these trays. Just drizzle with some olive oil. Sprinkle with a little more salt. This directly into my freezer. Same with the other tray. And then when I am ready to use this, ready to serve it, I'm just going to quickly warm these beans in a little bit of butter. Probably won't need any more salt at that point. I'm going to pull these from the freezer just once they're cool, and then they could sit either at room temperature or in my refrigerator, depending on how long. All right, so we are ready to reheat our sides because we're about there with plating. I have a saute pan that I'm gonna add, you know, a tablespoon of butter. I'm gonna do enough for 2 portions. I'm not gonna reheat the whole thing. You could leave this in the refrigerator, cover it with some plastic wrap. Probably don't even need all that butter. Take some out, and if I need to add more, I will. I can leave the rest in the refrigerator until I'm ready to use them. They'll last at least for a day or so. And they're fully cooked at this point, so I'm just trying to warm them. If I wanted to, I could toast a little garlic in that butter before I added those green beans. I could toast some sliced almonds, some brunoise shallots. Anything will flavor the butter. I just want to keep this really simple just because the flavors in the braise are really intense. I don't have black pepper anywhere else, so I'm going to add just a little bit of black pepper in here. And once they're fully warmed through, which takes about a minute, I can set them aside. I also have my potatoes, my pomme puree, and my cream, and I'll bring back up to temperature. And my potatoes are still slightly warm. I'm going to have them on a really, really, really low heat. Be careful, you can scorch potatoes if you're not careful. So I'm just going to leave that lid on until this cream comes up to temperature. Cream is warm. Low heat underneath my potatoes. I'm not adding a ton of cream. Just a spoonful. You can always add more. I want enough to make it so that they don't stand up too much on the plate. A nice puree. It's just a touch looser than mashed potato. Touch more cream. Just a touch more. That's almost what I want. Give it a taste to make sure it's still seasoned the way we'd like. Another pinch of salt, and another half a pinch, and we're ready to plate. And I'm going to add a touch of cream to this. Not yet though.
butter piece be too much?